Good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon, um, Dr. Maisha. And it's been only 24 hours since I've gone live. So, but I'm here just for a quick um, live broadcast today. I have been in these conversations about the difference between trauma aware, trauma sensitive, trauma informed, trauma responsive um, for the last few weeks. And I wanted to just come in and make that distinction today. So, we know that the idea of becoming informed is one that is a growing movement. And I think it's a very important movement. So, we hear a lot more people speaking about trauma, speaking about its impact, not only at the individual level, but at the level of relationship, the level of group, the level of community, and even at the level of organization. And so we're seeing, especially inside of initiatives for equity, for health equity, for equity in education, for inclusion, belonging, diversity, and justice, to really bring in more trauma-informed approaches. And so, it's interesting at this point, I'm actually in the process of recording a trauma informed communication course. And that will be something that will be launching later this summer. I'll share with you when that happens. But as I'm going through this process of doing the course, that distinction keeps coming up over and over again. What is the difference between being aware, being trauma sensitive, being trauma informed, and being trauma responsive? And as I've come into the study of the teaching of, and the more and more that I am going into the world of trauma, it's important to distinguish this for the people that I teach, the people that I train. And so we'll start with being trauma aware. It's the first step. So trauma, that this is a journey, and I like to often talk about things inside of a journey, because oftentimes inside of the culture that we are in, and particularly in cultures of oppression, it's always about the destination. And I always talk about, if you follow me, if you listen to the podcast, I talk about personal development being a mountain with no top. So when I think about the journey of trauma, of being trauma informed and trauma responsive, it starts somewhere, and there's always going to be sort of integration and continued learning. So I think I want to start with that. And so I think when we become trauma aware, we begin to understand the nature of trauma. We begin to understand what it is exactly and what it is not, and what it gets mistaken for. And I teach a lot about that when I talk in organizations. Like, trauma responses and trauma can be mistaken for a lot of things, and therefore the response to that can be also just as harmful as the experience of trauma itself, and create more trauma, create more harm. And so being aware of trauma, like what it is, what it looks like, what the fact that most of us are in some way, form, or fashion informed, or have experienced trauma in our life. I think that's a very important in that trauma aware process, like just understanding and beginning to beginning to have the lens of, there's some glasses over here, and when you put them on, you say, oh, that's what that is. And then we start to move into being trauma sensitive. So understanding that there are people who are informed by, or who are who have experienced trauma, who have that experience of, and have these responses. We can begin to interact with people in a different way, with a new understanding. So you have these glasses and you put them on, and you're aware, and then it creates a different listening from which you can respond differently. right? And oftentimes, there's an overlap between being trauma sensitive and trauma informed, because as you begin to be more sensitive to it, you move into this awareness, this sensitivity. Then the typically the next step is to begin to acquire and things that you can skills and things that you can do, applications in how do you interact with the person who may be informed by trauma, the person who may be activated by trauma, the person who may have recently experienced trauma. How do you interact with that person in a way that um, mitigates harm, that doesn't cause more harm? And also, because I think it's important to understand that there are things that we can do. We talk a lot about, the stress trauma continuum, right? So when does stress become toxic? When does toxic stress become trauma? We talk about that spectrum. How then can you make can you prevent stressful events from becoming toxic stress, from becoming events that land as trauma, right? So this is when we're beginning to move into trauma responsiveness, that sort of prevention. So we have this awareness, and as you can see, I'm describing the journey, there's a lot of crossover, there's a lot of integration. None of this is mutually exclusive. And I think it's so important to understand is that the journey doesn't happen like chop, 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 right? The journey happens on a spectrum. So there's this awareness and sensitivity of it, and then we begin to and acquire and learn the skills of interaction, of communication, of responsiveness. The other thing that we learn is like when we ourselves are impacted, when we ourselves are having our own trauma responses, what does that feel like? What does that look like? How can we then monitor and moderate our own spaces when we ourselves are becoming activated? So what are the emotional regulation tools? What are the emotional fluency tools that can help us when we're in spaces where we're we're experiencing that toxic stress, that we can begin to move it back into tolerable and healthy stress? And so when we move from trauma, that's the space of being trauma informed. And when we move into trauma responsiveness, we're looking at how do we, like, knowing that trauma can be in the background, knowing that there's this continuum, there's this spectrum from which healthy stress can go right into trauma without the resources, without um, the recovery, the respite, the support. Knowing that, how does an organization, how does a company, how does a family, how does a unit or a community begin to look at what are the structures in place that can create supports, that can create resources, that can create structures that actually help to mitigate or prevent things like toxic stress, things like, or can move or begin to move it backwards, move it from toxic stress back to tolerable stress, and to be able to prevent the actual trauma from happening itself. So that, I think, is the difference. And I think that why it's so important to move through that journey, not just as an individual. I think I love empowering individuals, as you well know, through this journey of being trauma informed and trauma responsive as an individual. And especially, like, for those of y'all who are coaches out there, who are therapists, who are leaders, it's important to have it as the individual skills of being trauma informed and trauma responsive. And the other piece around being trauma informed and trauma responsive is normalizing spaces that are designed to prevent and to mitigate trauma, normalizing training for staff, for colleagues, for leaders, normalizing that we know that trauma happens, like that is it's there's no avoiding that in a lot of spaces in the world, like out in the world, right? Because there's a lot of vicarious things that are happening that can cause trauma. So knowing that, how do you create a space in your organization? How do you create trainings that actually begin to prevent these things from happening? And I think that is why being on this journey of being trauma informed and trauma responsive, that's why it's so important for the organization. That's why it's so important for educators. That's why it's so important for community organizations where all of this is happening. So that is really the distinction that I wanted to make today, is just really what is the difference? What is the difference? And what does it mean for a person or for an organization? What does it mean to move from just being aware and even being sensitive to actually being informed and being responsive? And that does typically require a higher level of engagement, a higher level of conversation and training in the long run. And it is an ongoing process. It's an ongoing opportunity, especially as organizations have people come in and out, come in and out. It's an opportunity to shift culture. It's an opportunity to shift culture and to create psychologically and emotionally safe spaces for your people to be. When we bring it back down to the smaller unit level, to the organizational level, then it's an opportunity for oh, goodness gracious. Okay. It's an opportunity at the level of the family unit, at the level of the small community unit. It's an opportunity for families to deepen intimacy, to deepen safety inside of relationships. So I think um, that's the reason for one to be inside of an individual space or inside of a partnered relationship as a parent. I often talk about trauma-informed parenting. When we talk about trauma-informed parenting, one of the things that I talk about is breaking cycles. How do we break those generational cycles of harmful parenting? So in every space, there's an opportunity in becoming trauma informed and trauma responsive, but it starts with trauma aware and trauma sensitive. So that's the distinction that I'm making today. And my invitation to you, as I always have an invitation, my invitation to you is to, really start to look at and maybe study some, what does it look like? What does trauma look like? How can you be more trauma aware? How can you be more trauma sensitive? Let's just start there, right? Because again, because it's a journey, we don't, you shouldn't expect yourself to just jump from aware to responsive. So how do you begin to recognize and learn more about what it means to be trauma aware and trauma sensitive? That's the invitation that I have for you. And if you want to know a little bit more about that, if you want to know a little bit more about what I'm creating and inside of this world of trauma responsiveness and trauma informed communication, then you can check out the website, www.mindremappingacademy.com. And of course, if you're an organization and you want to know a little bit more about how I teach this work in organizations and companies and schools and community partnered organizations, just reach out to me. If you're on LinkedIn, you can reach out to me directly, or Facebook. If otherwise, you see the website right here, and you can just go there and schedule a call with me. Okay, so thank you for listening as always, and share this episode. I think this is an important topic of distinction for many people. So I invite you to share this talk, share this episode, and leave a comment to let us know what you think on your favorite podcast platform. I will see you on the next episode. Have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the week.